Okay, we're back on another conversation with Alan Otte, and we talked about last time that we were going to cover Herbert Brün, and I was just saying that I went back over the last few days just as I've had time late in the evening to read some of his essays, and it really requires more sleep, I think, to digest this stuff. But maybe for those that might be discovering this and don't know Herbert Brün, I wonder if you could give us a kind of a thumbnail sketch of his biography and how you came to know him. And
I spent time with him in Urbana at the University of Illinois, where he had come in the middle 1960s, and I think he was already in his late 40s by the time he had come from Europe. He had spent all those years of the Second World War in what was then Palestine as a jazz pianist, cocktail pianist in a club in Tel Aviv, escaping the Nazis in Germany. He went back to Germany and actually worked as a composer in theater. I mean, he did all kinds of serious composition. I mean, concert composition, but he also was connected to very high-level theater groups and wrote incidental music for Shakespeare plays. And so there's a whole body of his very interesting, entertaining music of that nature. And then he came to the University of Illinois as a research assistant in the middle 60s because he was looking for a way to use the computer. So he's quite famous in any books about the history of computer music. We'll talk about Herbert Brün. This is a real contribution he made, and a very philosophical guy, a brilliant writer and thinker, but quite a mathematician. And this is where he combined his musical and mathematical skills. And when the Black Earth Group first was formed, we went to Urbana, and I'd known of Herbert, and in fact, he was invited as a guest composer to Oberlin when I was an undergraduate there. So I met him over a period of a few days, even as an undergrad. And then the Black Earth Group was there in Urbana, and we went to his seminar. The whole group, all four of us, went to. He always had a seminar in experimental composition, which was just Herbert being wonderfully, difficultly philosophical, talking about whatever he wanted to talk about. And we arranged our rehearsal schedule so we could all be there, and that was a big influence on the group. The first piece he wrote for us is called "At Loose Ends" for percussion and piano, a big piano part. It's a wonderful, very traditional kind of chamber music piece. The group was also involved with Frederick Rzewski at that time. We met him around the same time. That's when we made the recording of Les Moutons de Panurge, which is the flip side of the album of Coming Together. Was a famous old LP. So what was interesting to me, especially, was that these were two composers who had a very deep connections to the social, the social connections of music, whereas Frederick has always been known as an overtly kind of political composer with all kinds of subjects, texts, and current sorts of things. And Herbert was another side of that coin, a much more philosophical side of that coin. And that was always part of what he talked about. And for Herbert, it was philosophical also in the sense that he brought it down to every level of the way one chose to live your life. You know, how you behave in your community, how you speak. He was very, very cognizant of English was his second language. He had a beautiful heavy German Jewish accent, and which made him, it was fun to be around him just for the way he spoke his philosophical English. um, but that's what his seminars were like too. He wouldn't let you get away with anything. And he liked the Black Earth Group. We were, four hippie drummers who had just rolled into campus, and we all had slightly different personal relationships with him, but that's sort of how it all began. And we saw him then after that first year where I saw him many times every week. The relationship then continued, especially for me. I just kept in touch for the rest of his life. He was a real mentor to me. So I thought it might be interesting to talk about these solo percussion pieces that he made, which come from the very beginnings of computer graphics. As far as we know, they may in fact be the first computer graphics made by a composer for the purposes of music. And they're very early in the whole history of solo percussion music as well. These are from 1967. There are three pieces from 67. So, Cage's 27 minutes piece is from 56, but it wasn't until 1962. So we usually think of Ziklus in 1959. There are a few other little German studies even before that, but 59, and King of Denmark from Feldman is in 1964. Mm-hmm. And then the next thing is these three pieces that Herbert made, which weren't published until much later in his life, and they're quite unusual, more sophisticated in a certain way kind of piece. So they're much less well known, but they are, in the very beginnings of the whole series of new pieces for the new idea of solo percussionists.
Well, you mentioned the Cage piece not premiering until, what did you say, 62?
Yeah, as far as
I'm drawing a blank on the history there. So who gave the premiere of that piece?
Well, the only thing that I can find in all of the Cage literature is a mention of a concert in Munich in 1962 with Kagel. And I'm at the moment I'm even forgetting the name of the percussionist. It wasn't a name that I knew either.
Okay.
So again, I think this comes back to what we were saying earlier with Cage, is that none of his music was published until 1962. I think that's a slight coincidence, that being the same year. I mean, I'm sure he was obviously involved in this concert and in a European tour.
Yeah.
And he had found someone that he wanted to give a try at this piece at that time. But it had been lying around for 8 years with nobody to really play it before then. So it's for all of us, for the whole history of all of these things, it's always fascinating to look at, who might have been at what concert, who had coffee with who, what was the influence, who was doing nearly the same thing in complete isolation and had
Yeah.
no idea that somebody else was interested in it.
Yeah. So I guess that begs the question then, to the extent that Brun was aware of what was, I mean, he would have been much aware of what Cage was doing at that in the 60s, right? Or would he have known about that percussion piece? Or was he sort of working independently on these percussion pieces?
Good question. Cage didn't come it's around then, it's in the late 60s that Cage first came to the U of I to also to use the computer. I don't know if Herbert thought of that. What he always said in these three pieces, the three different computer graphic pieces, are each dedicated to a different percussionist who was a graduate student at that time. Each of them, Al O'Connor, Bill Uhas, and Michael Ranta, were three graduate percussionists. So, very young guys.
Mm-hmm.
But Herbert said that he went to every concert of new music, that the percussionists were always the people who were the most, from day one, the people most interested and open to things. So these guys had played in his chamber music. He saw them play other things. By that time, had any of those people, maybe one of them had played Ziklus even at that, it's possible. But what he said, though, was that the most interesting thing for him was to observe how attentive percussionists behaved with their instruments. That it wasn't just to go and hear somebody play his own music or other interesting new music, but he was fascinated with really studying exactly what interested these young percussionists and in the ways in which they took care about doing this. And it was something about this combination of Herbert being fascinated by not just the sounds of percussion, but how careful people became engaged with it. And combining that with his interest in the computer. Now, he first came to Illinois with the idea of making sound with the computer, and that's what he did immediately. And in those days, and I even saw this when we were there, it still existed. This was a computer was as big as anybody's basement or bigger. It was in the engineering building, and you went there with boxes and boxes, shoe boxes full of these IBM punch cards, and you punched your code in and had little holes in, and then you fed thousands of these cards into a reader. It's just mind-boggling, but it turned out that the University of Illinois, which had, he always said, huge contracts with the Defense Department at that time for using this computer, also had a plotter, a machine that could, you could program all kinds of mathematical calculations, and it would draw these things. And I saw it once, and he had described to me, and again, it's quite primitive, kind of huge machine where there was a stylus, a pen here, and then two mechanical, an X and a Y axis, and the pen would move along one axis and then move along the other, and it was all the paper was on rolls at either side, so paper would move back and forth. So there was these three variables to do this, and Herbert, good-naturedly would laugh and say, you would spend countless hours doing these calculations, feeding in the cards, getting it all set up, and then the machine would start, and it would be making something beautiful or fascinating, and all of a sudden it would get stuck, and it would just rip everything up. And you'd have to take it all apart and start
again.
So, I don't remember asking him, the first stimulus of the idea of how the computer could then also draw musical things that could be used in a musical thing. But as you mentioned, this is not only this is the era, the late 50s and into the early 60s of other composers making very elaborate and beautiful quote graphic scores of different kinds. Herbert had been in Europe, through all those Darmstadt festival years and into the early 60s, and he knew all of these people very well. He knew Cornelius Cardew, and this is, it's the early 60s when Cardew made this big, beautiful piece called Treatise, which is all a hand-drawn score. So it was in the air, the idea of these kinds of scores. And though there's a number of series of even thousands of these graphics, finally, which are just single picture pieces, which he developed from the late 60s through the rest of his life. The very first ones were these 3 percussion pieces. And I've seen some of the studies that he had to do to make these. So there's all kinds of sophisticated mathematical calculations that go into, I mean, in a simple sense, I suppose you could say it's like analyzing, or maybe it's like analyzing some serial piece, which would be full of charts and graphs and numbers, all of this stuff, which spin out a structure that can have musical architectural sense. Mm-hmm. So he was doing these things, and the computer plotter had 2 different functions, as I understand it. It came with a set of discrete symbols, little pictures, and it could draw lines, and it could connect lines or connect the little discrete pictures. And then it could do all of this by various mathematical formulations and curves and all of that. And so what happened is that he would have to just speculatively put some information in and then wait, often overnight or the next day, or I don't know how long it would take before he would get it back. I remember calling him once at midnight, and I got his wife on the phone, and she said, "You just missed him. He just went to the computer." And I knew that was his time. Like his time, a couple of nights a week, started at midnight, because because the scientists and Defense Department and they got it all day during prime hours, and they were amused that some little composer wanted to fool around with it. So, come at 3 a.m. and it's true. I was going to show you. Do I have one of these right here? What is this one? Sorry, it's fun. Okay, so this is the roll, as it comes off the computer of plot.
Oh wow, the original, like an original printing.
Yeah,
oh, wow.
And down here, how did I miss this? Is it? Okay. Well, okay, so here it is. Here, you probably can't, I don't know if you can do it so well, but so it says, job W261 specified, all kinds of numbers, name Brün Herbert, March 30th, 1967, 6:05 and 28 seconds a.m. start. But I've got a couple of them that most of them, 6:05, that was great. Most of them say 3 a.m. and something like this. So, if you get some of these originals, for years and years, he could run it one time, and then he could, sometimes if you asked him for a copy, he would just go and run another copy. So some of these pieces have slightly different, initial start dates as to when the computer ran them. But he always kept his very first one. And then sometimes he would just take that to an architectural blueprint company, which is the only way that he could get these duplicated in those years. So what he found, and maybe it's easier, can you?
Yeah, I can see that.
See this okay? So, all these goofy little symbols are just what happened to be available on that plotter. And they don't mean anything. There's a triangle, the stop sign, which I think was as close to a computer could draw a circle back in 1967. An X, a Z, something that looks like a little doom bag or something. It had 13 different discrete little pictures it could draw. So one of the things that occurs to him is that, well, each of these pictures could represent an instrument, a percussion sound, and you choose whatever you want. And it turns out that the dumbest thing to do would be to see the triangle and decide that was going to be your triangle. You see they come in different sizes. So the computer, the program that he had developed would print, here's a bigger one and a smaller one of just sitting independently. So in the piece plot, he decided that would mean timbre, that the biggest one is the most normal, resonant kind of normal timbre, and the smallest one is the most distorted, muted, somehow changed timbre, however you do that, with the stick or however you would decide to do that. And then there's a whole range of these sizes. So the player decides that. And then the other thing is that the computer could just print them floating in space, or it could connect them one to another, or it could connect whole strings of them in. So after doing a couple of experiments and just looking at what the computer could output, he came up with this idea of making a structure where the percussionist chooses his or her own 13 sounds, and then the idea is either you play it, if it's just sitting there, you just play that instrument, you play that sound, and also, you see it's on a time scale, so it's in space this way, and it's up and down is dynamics on this one. So all the normal things of timbre and touch and time and volume are all controlled on this page. His idea was, if the symbols are connected, the percussionist has to find a way to transform the sound of one instrument into the next. So you make as a computer could sort of do, as you could do now, in electronic music, because he was making electronic music at that same time. This fascinated him, the idea of, how could you transform one sound into another? So, for instance, if you had a sequence of things where 3 different pictures and you had chosen that one was a tam-tam, one was a cymbal, and one was a triangle. Let's take a very easy example. So you've got just a moment to hit the tam-tam, and maybe you move from the center to the edge, and then you move from maybe just that. And at that point, you connect the edge of the tam-tam sound to a large suspended cymbal. So the tam-tam sort of turns into a cymbal. And then the cymbal, you might move from the edge towards the dome and switch from softer sticks to triangle beaters. And then you're playing triangle beaters on the dome, and maybe you take away one hand and then you reach over to the triangle and start playing the triangle. So you can see that you've actually, in a sense, turned one tam-tam stroke into one triangle trill.
Right. And that's plot. That's the piece plot that you're talking about. Yeah.
That's the one called plot. And the whole piece works on that assumption.
Yeah.
And when I did it, I looked for, in the beginning of the piece, partly I chose the instruments so that in the beginning of the piece, I could do things like that, things that I could imagine were really, I was doing a good job at making that transformation, that people would get it. You could hear that that was what was going on. I mean, the whole fun of the composition, certainly for Herbert, was that by the time you get further into it, you're getting all kinds of crazy connections, and how the hell are you going to make that? And sometimes you do it with pitch, sometimes you do it with rhythm. There would be other ways to do it, but that was Plot. The one called Touch and Go. I think what he noticed then. So in Plot, he was able to the computer would make these connecting lines, right? And he sort of noticed. I mean, okay, so if you just look at that one, you could say it kind of looks like a stick of some kind. There's a handle and there's a stick head.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay, so he so here's some pages of Touch and Go.
So the predetermined shapes become the different kinds of sticks. Instead of choosing 13 instruments, you choose different beaters, right?
Exactly. Again, so here it is, 13 different beaters, and now the beaters are floating in space at all of these different, at any angle on the clock face. So this was something, again, that he said he just noticed that good percussionists don't just stand there and hit it, that, there are upstrokes and downstrokes, and there are delicate finger techniques, and there are big body techniques. He noticed all of that. And he said, wouldn't that be fascinating to, I mean, it's sort of annoying, right? That's what we would like to use that of our own technique to make pieces better because we know how to do it.
Yeah.
Well, he wanted to compose.
Engineer that. Yeah, compose the movement.
Engineer is good.
Yeah.
So the way let me see. Do I have that in hand here?
While you're looking at hand, I would point people who are listening, if they want to read Herbert Brün talk about these pieces, it's the interview with him. It's called As to Percussion, is available on herbertbrun.org. You can go there and find the interview that Tom Syway did in 1984. And he talks about these pieces in there. And one of the things that I thought I would get you to comment on also is he had the idea, let's see, I had the image of a percussionist development and growth, and thought of three pieces in which the three aspects of that life and thought could be subject matter for the composition. And the three main items were connections, tools, and timbres. So Plot is about connections, as you've already mentioned, connecting one thing to another. Then Touch and Go is about the tools that we use, the implements. And then Stalks, the long one, Stalks and Trees and Drops and Clouds, is about timbre.
Exactly. So,
yeah.
Okay. So I'll
just as a background. Yeah.
Exactly. Good. So here, I mean, not that this is a little picture I drew for myself of a clock face, and you sort of see that coming down from 12 until 6, and then going back up the other side of the clock face from 6 until 12. Because I had to get this image of all of these sticks that are floating in space, that they're somewhere on a clock face, actually. So if they're coming down from 12 until 6, that's a downstroke. 12 o'clock is furthest away, a downstroke boom, from the shoulder. 3 o'clock might be a downstroke from the elbow. By the time you get right down to 6 o'clock, it's a downstroke from the fingers. As you go back up the other side of the clock face, then it's all upstroke. So going up from 6 is an upstroke with the fingers, upstroke with the wrist, upstroke with the elbow. Finally, an upstroke from the shoulder. So every touch you make in the whole piece is then he's showing you, how to think about where you might. And what was fascinating about that is just because then it's full of things that you would never think of doing, or ways to combine things. And again, you just choose any 13 different beaters. And when I did it, I rather than it being just literally 13 sticks, it should be categories. You're going to need extras anyway. So I had categories of brushes, and even there, brushes was everything from a delicate paintbrush to jazz brushes to, some sort of scraper. So that, a delicate little paintbrush you could sort of do as a finger upstroke, and a big, kind of house painting kind of, that was obviously do it from your shoulder. And, a jazz brush, you could actually play something for a moment in a bunch of different ways.
Well, I think it's worth saying that your solution to this piece, which, and this is something else maybe that we could talk about, but about how an interpretation of a piece gets into performance practice, right? So anybody that had seen you play this piece at PASIC or had discovered the video of you doing it online will see that you're playing this on a tabletop. So your solution was to really focus the attention on the implements and not so much on the instrument or the sound that you're making, but really getting inside the engineering of all of that movement, the choreography of all of that. And so to highlight that, I don't know why you chose the table, but in my mind, why you chose the table was to very clearly show that all of those shapes, and the tabletop just seemed like a really good solution for that. I think you have some other things too. There's a garbage can or something on the side as well. That, but here's the thing is that now, I haven't played that piece, and I haven't had any students play that piece. I haven't seen anybody else play the piece. I've only seen your version of it. And so to me, that's burned in my mind of, well, that's how you play that piece. I can't, I suppose, someone could imagine it for a snare drum or on a marimba or something, or a big multi setup of such things. But it's sort of, your solution is so elegant in highlighting what the piece is about. I can't imagine it another way. So can you talk through a little bit, like, how did you figure out to do the tabletop? Like, what was did you try it on other things and then arrive at the tabletop, or did you set out like?
It's a story I like. Thanks for asking. So I had played Plot first. That was okay. And Herbert had seen me play Plot. I actually played it at some PASIC, very long time ago.
Oh, okay.
That was the first one that interested me, and I made a version of that. Okay, so I'm talking to him on the telephone one day, and we're both invited. He's an invited composer to PASIC again. This was in Tempe, Arizona, so I'm maybe in the 90s or something like that. And I was invited too. And, we talked about other things. And then he says, and I'm looking forward to, and we'll see one another in a few months in Arizona. And I'll hear you play Touch and Go. I'm looking forward. And I said, oh, no. I play Plot. I'll be playing Plot. That's the one I play. And he says, oh, yes, you play Plot. That's right. You play Plot. Okay, so we hang up. So in those days, I talked to him with some, every week or something about something. It comes up again, and I don't know if it happened in 2 or 3 phone calls. The phone call ends, and he says, "And so looking forward to hearing you play Touch and Go." And no. I play Plot. I'm going to play Plot. And he said, oh, yes, you play Plot. That's right. You're the player of Plot. Okay, good. That'll be wonderful. Good. We hang up. At some point, I said, oh, Jesus, he wants me to play Touch and Go. I actually thought, oh, it's so sad. This brilliant man is getting a little senile. He can't even remember from one week to the next what I tell him. And then all of a sudden, I said, no, he's not senile. He wants me to play Touch and Go. So here was the thing. I thought that Touch and Go was a bad piece. I'm not criticizing any other player, but I'm just saying that in the early days of these things, they all came about at a time when you know what Ziklus looks like, I mean, the big setups, and this was the fun thing, and everybody made huge setups, and I'd seen a performance or two even of that. And imagine if you have a huge setup with all kinds of, vibraphone and xylophone and lots of drums and tam-tams and all of this stuff. You might be playing the piece perfectly and choosing a different stick and upstroke and downstroke. But what any hearer is hearing is just thousands of improvised notes all over keyboard instruments and crazy rhythms, and I thought it was awful. And I always felt, well, sure, Herbert's a brilliant guy, but all good composers have lesser pieces. That's a bad piece, And I had no interest ever in doing this piece. Okay, so now I knew that he. For some reason, he wants me to play that piece. Okay, I better take this seriously. But just as you were saying, I said, well, what is the problem? There's the problem with the piece, that if you play all different kinds of instruments, any normal person is going to be attracted to the sound and timbre of all of those instruments, and they're not going to pay any attention at all. So the only way to do it is to make the instrument that it be of as little interest as possible. What could the least possible interesting thing be? Well, a tabletop. It does nothing. So then you'll actually have to watch everything, I do. That's how it came about. Okay. So, and then I found after, the piece takes me 15 minutes to play the piece, even I was dissatisfied with just the tabletop. So the garbage can, just the tabletop is wood, so a metallic kind of sound. Once in a while, I could saw on a metal thing, or that's how the garbage can became useful, and was for a little bit of a variation. So that's, and it's been really a wonderful history. I mean, I've stuck with the piece. I get it out periodically. During his 100th anniversary year in 2018, I got it out and revisited the whole thing again, and tremendously satisfying. And it does exactly what he wanted it to do. It teaches you about, one thing I did do there is that I partly figured out to do in many cases. I made choices where to just use that thing would already satisfy the kind of stroke that he was asking for. So that there would always be something of that nature where, the only way, if you're going to do loud sawing, it's probably going to be coming, it's easy enough for that to come from your shoulder.
Yeah.
Where, etc. Things like that. Or there's one where somehow something that I decided was hands. One of the pictures was going to be just hands or fingers, and a hammer comes in, and somehow the hand thing is in the picture is floating over the hammer thing. It's quiet, and the hand thing is clearly a finger downstroke. So, for instance, I just picked up the hammer and then tapping on the hammerhead with fingers, so the hammer does its hammering, but it's coming through the fingers, something like that. It's actually what the picture is there. But yeah, you're right. Anybody would. It could have been anything.
Yeah.
Different decisions. I'm not sure what to say about that. I would say that Stephen Chick once brought it up. He and I were having this very conversation not so long ago, and he said he regretted that some of the things he's done, Safa or whatever, he made certain choices about instruments that he used or the way he played it. He never meant it to become the right way to do it. But, one has students who admire what you did, or in a sense, not to be self-congratulatory here, but okay, it was a good solution,
Yeah. To me, it's a very good solution, and it's almost one that makes the most sense out of when I look at I mean, I think it's hard to take that piece out of context too with the other two, right? Because one is, they all have very distinct purposes in terms of like what he was going for, the connections, tools, and timbres. So with the tools, you want to, if you're thinking of it in that context with those three pieces, it seems obvious to me that you would want to have some kind of limited sound palette so that you could explore the full range of all the different beaters. But
I think doing it on a large bass drum would be like the next step.
Next thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And I mean, I wonder if one couldn't, if you made it a marimba piece or a vibraphone piece, or maybe a marimba piece. I mean, you'd have to be careful you'd have to think about the materials. I mean, the pitch material, how you were going to do it. But I think you might be able to do that. But again, it would be just one source. And after, you can imagine you would be doing all kinds of glissandos and smearing around. And after a while, I think it would be pretty obvious that it was about the body.
The body. The tools.
Yeah, the tools. Yeah. But I do love the piece. And then Stalks and Trees and Drops and Clouds, the piece about the timbres,
which is the one I've played. The one that resonated with me was this one. I got it as soon as I saw it. I said, I know how to play that piece. I get it.
So here are. So again, and you see it's the same thing that the computer was capable of drawing. Here are the same 13 pictures, and now we're again back to instruments. These are instrumental choices, but the computer could draw a connecting line directly to the timeline. So these are stalks, or it could connect all of those bottom level things, but connect them to one point. So that's a tree. Whereas if they're connected to separate points up here, those are drops, obviously. And here, if they're connected to one point, it's a cloud. And then his idea, the timbre idea, was that the things on the bottom, the stalks or the trees, are dry. So they're going to be drums or wood sounds or cardboard boxes, something like that, something dry, not so resonant. And the things hanging from the upper level are going to be ringing or resonant sounds. So, mostly metal kinds of things. And it's easy enough to figure out how you're going to play individual boom, 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 that, or individual drops. And clouds are not so hard either. And again, the computer the computer drew this thing. And then Herbert had to figure out, now, how will I tell someone? He had to stare at this and say, now, let me see, how can I make? So his idea is that when you see a cloud, you start with that instrument of the cloud. Ding, 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 add that one, you just add them. So it's all one big cloud. And once you're past the midpoint, you can, if you want, start letting go of original things. Right. So even that's not so hard. If those are symbols or triangles or bell, whatever, you can get a little cloud of things going. Mm-hmm. And if it were this, even that's not so hard. You have a cloud of all kinds of ringing sounds, which are punctuated with individual thumps, maybe foot pedals even, or whatever. But you can. Herbert was very interested in the idea of making musical phrases where you had to interrupt yourself as you made the phrase. So here you're making a beautiful cloudy phrase up here, but you have to continually, in microseconds, interrupt yourself to do these things. So hard one, of course, is the trees, because a poor solution, which in the early days of this, decades ago, if you think of it like a cloud, I mean, the cloud, you sort of do rolls or little tremolos or jostlings to get them going. If you do that down here, ultimately it just sounds bad, right?
Right. Exactly.
You can't really, you can't roll between all of these different things like that. So I mean, that's a fascinating, to solve this problem, even just by itself. and then to interrupt it with other kinds of
Yeah.
things.
Well, part of the solution, as I recall, that you suggested to me was to have things that would, on their own, create their own sort of rhythms. So Christopher Dean made me these things that were these aluminum sticks, and they had like tambourine jingles. You remember this?
Mm-hmm, I do.
They had like tambourine jingles, so you could hit it, and then it would just flop and go like that, and it would just go on its own. And then I had a bicycle wheel with a little triangle beater in it. So there were some things where that were very, you had to sort of figure out mechanical ways of making things that had multiple articulations, and that made some of those things possible, which otherwise, I mean, I don't know how you
it's one of the three pieces that I haven't played, and I sort of hope that I will do it before.
I would, yeah, I think you should. I think everybody would. I think everyone deserves to have an Alanati version of Stalks and Trees and Drops and Clouds for those, especially for those of us that have played that piece, because it is I mean, I think all of these are really. There is his book, When Music Resists Meaning. There's resistance in those pieces that you really come against some things that are really difficult to figure out what to even do. And I remember playing that Stalks and Trees and Drops and Clouds, and just for months and months at a time playing it. I want you to talk about in that piece, and maybe all the pieces are that way, but he gives the instruction at the end. So you have like 3 periods of practice with the piece. So first you study the instructions and you follow it to the letter, and you learn everything exactly as it is in the score. And then the second period is put it away. Don't practice it for a while. Put the thing away. And then the third phase is you come back and you drastically, what does he say? Take the proportions out of proportion, make different proportions out of it. Just turn it into wildly exaggerate things. And do you remember what's the language in there?
He said, remembering the phrase, old favorites, one heartbeat ago, now they are leeches.
Right. What does that mean?
And not that you should do that for the whole 15 minutes of the piece. Yeah. What I think what he's, again, brilliantly saying, and this is a composer of crazy, beautiful mathematical graphic scores and highly serialized string quartets and all kinds of beautiful, a very intellectual guy who can sit down at the piano and not only play any jazz standard that you just name. I mean, he'll just sit down and start playing it, but he'll sit down and play Verdi and Wagner and Mozart, anything just from, he's an old world, beautiful musician in this way. Meaning that he knew that once the computer had, by some random number seeding, he did his mathematical structures. You enter that into the computer, you press a start number, and it spins out any number of variations of these kinds of structures and overlays and relationships and all of that. If he's going to leave it up to the percussionist then to choose the instruments that you love the best, what instruments do you own? Which ones do you like? Which ones would you like to have here? If Herbert were there doing the piece with you, he would have a discussion with you and say, oh yeah, that's beautiful. That's a beautiful instrument. You should go slower there. I'd love to hear that more. Or yeah, I understand you kind of need something like that. It's kind of a drag to have to listen to it right now. Could you get through that faster?
Yeah, exactly.
It'll be useful later, but right now, do we really have to listen to it? I mean, I know the computer said you should spend 5 seconds, but why don't you not?
Yeah.
That's what I mean. I came to understand that that's what he meant. That as you said so correctly, you can't start there. You have to be honest about making yourself do it, solve the problems that are there. Once you've got them solved and you do it, and then you take a break from it, when you come back to it, you say, but there's real art here. I mean, this moment of painting with this brush, which makes no sound at all, is actually about the most tender moment in the whole 15 minutes, and I'm not going to do it for 2 seconds. I'm going
Right.
to
Can
do
do that for longer.
it
Yeah.
for longer, you know.
Well,
So
it's worth saying too that the piece, at least Stalks and Trees and Drops and Clouds, has. I remember there's a chart at the bottom which tells you each page is a minute. Am I remembering that correctly? Or a
correct,
certain amount of time.
they're different, but
They're
yeah.
different, but they're structured in a way so he tells you, okay, you play this page and then so many seconds of silence in between, and then these two pages go together, and then now some time in between. And he also suggests that you are changing those amounts of time too, like you said. So this page, even though it says to play that for 2 minutes, maybe that goes by in 30 seconds, whereas this other one is much longer. But then the pictures, the overall structure in between is that these 3 pages go together, and then there's a break, and then there's 1, and then there's a break, and then there's maybe 5 together, and then a break. So in your touch and go, I think you're showing that with also a light. Is that right? The light's turning on and off. Are you showing us that structure of the? Okay.
And in that piece, I think unlike Stalks and Trees that you did, where he does show more, grouping, a single page, a longer set of pages, and all that. In Touch and Go, I ended up doing it by pages, but by each individual frame. Though you vary the distance between the frames. And some you stop and then go on as soon as, stop, wait 3 seconds and now go on. Sometimes you wait 15 seconds or whatever, but it's always a single page. However, yeah, the whole thing of the light only came later in my practice session, because I realized the same thing, that if what I want people to do is pay attention to how I'm using my hands, and that what implements I'm picking up and using, then it was a huge distraction when I was done with that page. Okay, okay, this doesn't count. I move them all up, then I get ready to do the next one. Okay, now this counts. Now watch me do that. Well,
right.
You can't do that. So that's where the light came in, is that I had to be able to prepare all of the next frame, everything I needed and how I was going to need it, in the dark, so that when the light came on, now you paid attention to the next thing to do.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
Which, and of course, there's all kinds of mishaps in the dark.
Yeah.
But,
okay, well, that makes a lot more sense.
yeah.
We're sort of coming to the end of our hour here. Is there more to talk about? I mean, obviously, there's more to talk about with Herbert Brün. Should we come back and do a part 2 of this and pick up and talk about it a little more, or maybe that spills into something else?
Yeah, exactly. I could think about it if there's things I really want you to know about this.
Okay, well, any closing thoughts then on these? Obviously, these 3 pieces are very important in terms of that early percussion repertoire. I don't have a sense of how often they're played. I always show them to my students, and they always say that's too hard. They don't want to do that.
I've talked to Mike Rosen at Oberlin about it, and Mike was a student, was another grad student at Illinois in those days, so he knew Herbert. Was himself a little bit more in the symphonic trajectory, but
Sure.
He played some things. And of course, he knew these pieces and he had them all. And he said in all of his decades at Oberlin, he has not given them to an undergraduate student, because he said he just felt that they were such a deep philosophical engagement with everything, all the levels of meaning and exploration, that which were too dear to him to just let it, sort of shrug it off and let some 19-year-old. But times change. I mean, people are playing marimba at a level today that did not exist even a decade ago, much less 25 years ago.
Yeah.
So there's, it's a little bit of a disappointment to me in my undergraduate years was the birth of the whole multiple percussion thing, and Ziklus and King of Denmark, and the whole idea of how exciting it was to, for the first time, have these big pieces of all of these huge setups. Well, of course, it's a pain in the butt actually to get all these things together, to have it set up, to keep it set up in one sort of room. And once marimba music and other kinds of things came into our purview on this, people engaged less with these huge setup pieces.
Yeah.
It's not like I can't understand why, but it's also too bad in a sense that some of these things. So there were a number of reasons why those two, yes, you can't just put these pieces on the music stand and start playing. You have to study them, think about them, and then you have to write all over them. I mean, I couldn't possibly play just from his computer pictures. I'd never remember how I had solved that. So mine are just color coded and all kinds of I write in rhythms, I write in all of that stuff. So there's a big commitment to being involved in these pieces. I do think, though, that even grappling with a page or two of any of them as an etude is a really spiritual and intellectual and technical opening for anybody.
Mm-hmm.
There's no reason why we should just be doing etudes, which, we don't have to do so many Delacruz etudes. You get the idea. you can do a couple of them very, very well. You can probably handle that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I think we could use some of these other really brilliant ideas as etudes and just engage with, with. And then for the individual where that idea really catches, well, great. Now, maybe go on and try to do the whole piece. I was going to say, but the third reason that they are lesser known is just because we've said this before about other composers that they usually are most interested in whatever they're doing right then.
Yeah.
So Herbert was fascinated with his work at Illinois, with the computer. He had fascinating students around him all of the time. So he didn't really need to find a publisher, somebody who was going to distribute his music worldwide. It wasn't until Sylvia Smith made her publishing company. She and Stewart had been students there back in the 70s, and Herbert was happy to have a former student of his take some of his music and put it in her catalog. So,
and that's how these pieces are available now, is through Smith Publications. Anybody can go and find, and not just these pieces. He has a number of pieces. Did they pick up? Yeah, exactly. I didn't remember what all they had.
A bunch of his chamber music.
Okay, yeah. One of my favorite pieces of his is that piece Futility, the tape piece.
Yeah.
I love that piece.
It's with the, it's actually
1964, Futility 1964. Is that,
yes.
I'm remembering that?
The speaker on there with this very elegant language, his German wife who learned English in England, and Mani, his wife, was the secretary. Secretary in a very, quite heightened sense. Of Bertolt Brecht, of the playwright Bertolt Brecht. Wow. After the Second World War, she was his, assistant, sort of, as a younger woman, because her father was an actor who was a new Bertolt Brecht, and this was Herbert's connection to the whole world of German theater at the highest possible level. So it's Mani who reads this again, crazy poem that Herbert wrote.
Yeah.
For this electronic music piece. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe a little bit more of this next week. We'll see where it goes. Okay, very good.
Great. Nice
Thanks.
to talk. Okay. Bye-bye.